This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Today we are joined as usual by none other than Mustache Chris, Chris the Canadian. Today we're focusing in on one particular aspect of the much bigger tale of famous or maybe infamous mob associate Henry Hill. Henry Hill was the central figure in the book Wise Guy, which was made into the movie Goodfellas. One of the most important and shocking crimes Hill exposed when he became state's witness was that of the Lufthansa Heist in 1978. In this one stick-up, almost $6 million in cash and jewels was stolen at the time. That's over $25 million in today's money, making it one of the most expensive armed robberies in history. Let's dig into this fascinating bit of mafia and American history and look out in next episode as we talk about the classic mafia movie Goodfellas. I think as a good way to really start before we even dig in, Chris, is what did you think about Henry Hill as a person? Because he's really central to all of this.
Initially, like watching the movie Goodfellas, I thought, he seemed like a pretty cool guy, I guess, especially when you're younger. Like the mob does kind of come across as, oh, these guys are kind of cool. But like in researching for this episode and then like kind of researching the cast of characters and the Lufthansa Heist and when we get to the Goodfellas, just looking into their background, I find myself not liking Henry Hill all that much, to be completely honest with you. I find him to be quite a despicable person.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that after doing some research into this and you kind of peel away the romanticism of Goodfellas, and we won't get too much into the movie as such today, but I think you just have to, the movie looms so large over the story. Once you strip it away and you start to look at these guys, they're really low-level criminals. They're not criminal geniuses. They're to the point, and then you've got psychotic murderers mixed in. And, it's just, it is not as romantic as the movie portrays it.
Yeah, for sure. And especially somebody like Henry, we'll get into it later in the episode, but it just seemed like Henry seemed to liked all the benefits of being part of the mob and the criminal organization. But as soon as it became inconvenient, he was like, okay, I'm out.
So let's talk about some of the background on some of the major players and some of the events. We won't get into blow by blow of the movie, but because Lufthansa is really the high watermark of all of these guys. So let's start off with Henry Hill, who was a part of Capo de Regime, I think was his official title, Paul Vario. What was a little bit of Henry Hill's background?
Surprisingly, we don't know like a ton about like Henry Hill. Like we know his dad was a union worker. He grew up in a pretty large family. One of his brothers, I believe, was paralyzed from birth. But he grew up in Brooklyn. He grew up pretty poor, and he grew up like idolizing the guys that worked at the cab stand, which is famously portrayed in the movie Goodfellas. And this is where Paul Vario hung out. Other than that, like we don't really know a ton of information about Henry in his early life. It wasn't nice, but it wasn't terrible either.
No, he had a mom, a dad, a big family, but apparently he was really young when he got involved with the cab stand. I think he was in his early teens.
Yeah, I think he was like 13, 14 or something. He was quite young.
And he was a half Italian, half Italian, half Irish. And that was kind of his, I guess, hook into the organization.
Yeah, his mom was his mother was the Italian half, and his father was the Irish half. But it also made like he also wasn't able to ever be like a made guy, right? I'm sure Henry, if he was full Italian, probably would have been a made guy in the mafia. Maybe things would have played out a little bit differently. But yeah, like I said earlier, other than that, like we don't really get it. Henry never really talks all that much about his young childhood. His father apparently was very high on him staying in school, and obviously Henry didn't do that, so he used to get beatings every once in a while. But he seemed to have looked down on his father because he worked like a blue collar job and tried to make an honest living. And yeah, he doesn't really talk about his mother all that much. And I always thought it was kind of weird that he never really talked about his early life all that much.
I almost got the sense that, yeah, they were really poor in a poor part of Brooklyn, but they were semi on the American dream path. His father was a hardworking guy in the union. He didn't make a ton, but that was kind of the time period. But, that generation was really trying to set up Henry's generation to be legit, and Henry decided to not be legit.
Yeah, and this is where, like, in a lot of ways, like Italian Americans were the main victims of the Italian mob. And in a lot of ways, you think if you're Henry's father and you're trying to set a good example for him, he's got a good union job. He's trying to teach his kid a good work ethic. But they're like right across the street, there's a bunch of criminals that nobody gives parking tickets to, and they seem to get whatever they want. And it's kind of like nowadays, I guess, with people talk about stuff like gangster rap or what have you, and the kids look up to these guys. And I mean, then you look at your father who's like breaking his back, trying to raise a big family, just barely getting by. And, you see Paul Vario down the street and, he's swimming in cash. You're going to look up to that guy. And not necessarily, the rest of his family didn't fall into this life, but Henry did.
Now let's move on to James Jimmy the Gent Burke. He's really probably in a way the central character of this whole story.
Yeah, Jimmy Burke was when he was 2 years old, he was left at the footsteps of an orphanage, from my understanding. And growing up, he was physically abused, sexually abused, and then he ended up getting one foster family who weren't very nice to him. He got into an argument with the father or something when he was driving, and the father went back to, give him a smack or something like that. And there was a car accident, and the father died. And the mother, the foster mother, blamed him for his death. Obviously, that didn't work out. And then he found a half decent family that tried to raise him properly. But by that point, Jimmy was going down the road of a criminal. There was really no stopping it. So it's not surprising. And then Jimmy got busted for some crime, and he was in prison at a pretty young age. And this is where he kind of gets into contact with the Italian mob within the prison. And from my understanding, he did hits for guys in prison when he was, I don't know, like 18, 17, like really young. 19, he was already doing hits.
Yeah, I think we see Jimmy Burke is a lot like a lot of the other people that we've seen in Roy DeMeo's story. They were never going to become made men, but they were very useful to the mafia to do a lot of jobs that the mafia couldn't do.
Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, like, Jimmy Burke was full-blooded Irish, right? So he wasn't even half Italian, unlike Henry.
Jimmy was attached directly to Paul Vario's crew, which that puts him in contrast to somebody like Richard Kuklinski, who was never a part of Roy DeMeo's crew, or at least we don't know that. And I think when you learn about some of these other guys who are actually a part of a crew, it's always sheds light on Richard Kuklinski, I think.
Yeah. Well, from my understanding, like the Jimmy, we'll get into, Jimmy was a really good earner. From my understanding, like the Lucchese family, which is the family that all these guys are part of that we're going to be talking about, the Lucchese family used to like lend Jimmy out once in a while, but you'd have to pay a fee, which is crazy, for lend out an Irishman to another Italian, but it's probably unheard of.
Yeah, I mean, he's a talent and they wanted to use him. I think before we touch on our last guy that we're going to talk about, we should talk about the Lucchese family and what they were doing in this whole era. This whole thing surrounds the JFK, John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. And it probably a lot of people have flown into it, and it's absolutely massive. And it's smack dab in the middle of the city, but it's in Queens and it's kind of on the outskirts of New York City. But it had a very interesting situation of how the mafia controlled it, because the mafia did very much control this airport.
Yeah, it was a weird situation. I was reading a little bit about it, and like the Colombo family, officially, I guess JFK Airport was their territory, but they would let the other families do, heists and jobs inside JFK Airport, but you'd have to pay a fee. And this is what the Lucchese family was doing. The Lucchese family itself is pretty interesting because it's one of those, it's basically the family you don't hear about. It was for most of its history, it's very peaceful. It was very low key. There wasn't any crazy type of wars like with the Colombos or the Bonanos, like the Civil Wars, and flashy guys like John Gotti with the Gambinos, and kind of lunatics with the Genovese. And they had a close connection to the Gambino family, the Lucchese family. This is the type of work that they say they kind of specialized in, was basically stealing stuff. Stealing cars, stealing stuff in the airports. This is what they were really good at.
Yeah, from my understanding, they were. You had mentioned it, the blue collar mafia. They were more into and maybe not the most dramatic elements of the mafia, but they made decent money in stealing cars, but they weren't really heavily invested into drugs. Like, I think Paul Vario owned a string of junkyards, and that was where he made a lot of money from, and car lots and that sort of thing. That's where they were making money on things that weren't. I mean, I guess in retail trade, you might say low profit margin kind of things.
Oh, it's just a funny tidbit about Paul Vario. He made like a ton of cash running a flower shop, like selling flowers. I just thought that was funny. This ruthless mob capo, and he's selling bouquets of flowers to wedding couples and sending them to other mob funerals and stuff. I just thought that was pretty funny.
I think that brings up an interesting thing about Paul Vario and so many of these guys. Paul Vario had so many legitimate businesses, and he probably could have done very well for himself. Paul Castellano made a fortune off of his legitimate businesses. Somebody like Paul Vario, and they've said it in the books, he just loved to steal. He loved being a criminal.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's, I mean, in the movie Goodfellas, it's like a running theme is like the lifestyle becomes addictive in the sense like it's nice having the door open for you, or it's nice at going through the back and you have like a group of friends that you guys all hang out with. And I mean, somebody like Paul Vario, he kind of grew up around it too, right? So being a criminal was just, I don't know, it's just natural. It's kind of like, it's just like habits, like you notice between people who are like working class and middle class and like upper class. It's just stuff, I don't know, you just grew up around with, you just do, and you don't even really notice it. I assume that was probably the same with Paul Vario.
I wonder too, I mean, this is the sense that I got from him. I had a friend way back in the day, and he was from the same kind of middle class, straight of the road middle class. And his parents bought him stuff, but he just loved to steal. Like if he was in a store, he was going to steal something, and I don't know if it's he loved the rush of it, or he just had sticky fingers, and he was always looking to like get into some sort of score and I think that's kind of that's the thing that I got from Paul Vario, is that he could have made an absolute fortune of selling flowers, but he also wanted to steal stuff.
Yeah, it was like, and a little bit of personal information myself. Like I've grown up pretty blue collar most of my life, and still am pretty blue collar. And growing up in that type of environment, you notice some people. I would know some people that they just couldn't help themselves from. They had to commit crimes, and even stuff they didn't have to do. And you're sitting there and you're scratching your head, and it's like, I don't understand. Like, why are you doing this? And like I don't know, for whatever reason, they just seem to have to do it. They're always in trouble with the law in one way or another. And I don't know, it's one of those really bizarre things where you try to tell them, it's like, you could not do this. And then they just don't understand. It's like you're speaking Mandarin to them or something.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. Now, the last major character, we'll get into a whole boatload of minor characters, but the last one we really need to talk about is Tommy DeSimone.
Yeah. Tommy DeSimone, who was portrayed Joe Pesci famously in the movie Goodfellas. He was actually, in real life, he was a lot younger, and he was also a fairly large man. He wasn't short like Joe Pesci was. He grew up in the mob, basically. His uncles and then his grandparents, and I believe his father was involved in the mob too. And his family's pretty big in the LA region. I couldn't really get a ton of information on that, but I read that they were pretty big in the LA region. So he was basically born into it, and he kind of grew up with a chip on his shoulder, because I was reading about, apparently his brother became an informant at one point, and it kind of put a black stain on the family. But like I said, he grew up with it, like to the point where he was in that famous scene in the movie where the one guy's giving Tommy a hard time about shining shoes. He actually did do that. That's true. He used to shine these guys' shoes to make a few extra bucks. And later in his life, him and Henry end up becoming like good friends. It was later in the movie Goodfellas. It seems like they were like really young at the time, but it was actually later in their lives. And he just did the stuff that Henry and Jimmy and Paulie were doing, stealing. He was really good at collecting debts, as the movie Goodfellas depicts. But he was a loose cannon. It's interesting when you compare Jimmy and Tommy, where Tommy would freak out. Like, you never knew when Tommy was going to freak out. He could freak out. You crack a joke and all of a sudden somebody's dead, right? Where Jimmy's ruthlessness was more calculated, where he would pick and choose when to be ruthless. And Tommy, you never knew what was going to happen. So, I mean, if you're interacting with either one of these guys, I don't know which one's more scary. The guy that you just don't know, if you say something, he's just going to freak out and murder you, or the guy that's going to plan it out for 2 months.
We should really talk about, just to round Tommy DeSimone off, is that in Goodfellas, one of his famous scenes is him murdering a made guy over really just blowing his temper got out of control of him, and he killed. And that's something that happened in real life, is that they killed a made man. I think his name was Billy Bats was his nickname. His name was like William Bonaventura or something. It doesn't really matter, but they just I think it was in Jimmy's bar. They just killed this guy, and it was heat of the moment, but it was also calculated too.
It was in Henry's bar. Yeah, but like you said, it was just Tommy killing him was like completely heat in the moment. And then, but I did a little bit of research. Apparently, Jimmy had taken over that loan sharking book or something like that. And I guess when he got out of prison, he wanted it back, and Jimmy didn't want to give it back up. So he's like, well, Tommy wants to do it anyways, and I don't want to give up the book. So, we'll kill two birds with one stone, basically. In the movie, it seems, but like, basically telling a guy to go try and shine his shoes or what have you, which initially started off as a joke, and then Tommy took it the wrong way. And then the other guy got a little bit pissed off, but it was just like a spur of the moment thing where, Tommy just flies off the handle and kills a made guy, which is just a huge no-no in the mob. You just don't do that, especially when you're not a made guy.
There's a whole process if a made guy needs to get whacked, they call it a sit down, and the parties involved talk it out, and there might be members from the other families involved, and it's a actual legitimate process. And going outside of that process, that when they eventually did find out, and I didn't realize that his name is Billy Benvetta. He was really close friends with John Gotti, which John Gotti is going to come in a very interesting way when we get on a little bit.
Yeah, and the whole system of the made guys is one of the reasons why the mob was so successful. Unlike other gangs, where other gangs didn't have this kind of institutional structure in place, guys would just get whacked all the time randomly. Where in the mob, because they had this system where it was regimented, and you had made guys and non-made guys, and it was a process to get rid of the made guy, and it was a way for the bosses and the capos to be able to keep control, with what was actually going on. So you had to go seek permission, and it wasn't something that was taken lightly. Made guys were hit all the time, but there was usually justified reasons for it. Buddies talking, or he hit somebody's made guy, or he did this or he did that, and you'd have to justify it. And sometimes you get approval and sometimes you don't. When we get into Gotti, this whole system probably will become we'll get more into it. It'll be a little bit more clearer.
The main character almost in this is the JFK Airport. We alluded to it, but JFK Airport was really an ATM, money cash machine for these mafia people. They could just steal as much as they wanted to from it. And it almost seemed like the airlines and the shipping companies didn't even care, because I guess we should get, most people are probably aware that passenger travel is one thing, but a lot of cargo and freight comes through these airlines as well.
Yeah. It almost seems like it was a problem, and the airports for the most part didn't seem to really care all that much, because they would just collect the insurance off of stolen cargo. And me and you've been talking about it before. At the time, like, everyone was doing so well that a couple boxes falling. Well, it was more than a couple boxes, because the mob started getting greedy. But some stuff going missing, nobody really cared all that much about it. I mean, once they actually started caring about, this cargo going missing and people's stuff going missing, it did stop pretty quickly. But at this time, they were just more than happy just to collect the insurance money off of it.
Yeah, it really is one of those systems. Well, one thing, New York was the center of the world. Everything was coming in there, and a lot of it was coming through JFK. And like you were saying, there was insurance, there was covered, there was so much largesse coming in. And it's really in the late 1970s, that's when that stuff is starting to dry up. And the companies are having to tighten up their belts a little bit.
Well, they would actually work it into their, their yearly budget or what have you, like stuff just getting stolen. Like that was actually worked into the budget. Like, oh, this amount is probably going to get stolen. And, the airport companies and trucking companies would do this. And it seems crazy to us now that you just work that into your budget. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to have millions of dollars stolen by the mob, but whatever. It is really crazy because that would never happen. Well, I mean, they do work it into their budget in terms of like, how much is the staff going to steal and how much is actually going to get stolen, how much is going to get lost. But these guys knew who kind of had a pretty good idea who was doing most of the stealing.
Well, again, I just thought of an idea for a really interesting thing that's happening now that we can maybe sink our teeth into with agricultural crime in the West Coast of the U.S. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and there's a lot of thievery into that. And so maybe that might lend itself to talk a little bit about that. That never goes away. The criminals are always going to try and find a way to steal.
Oh yeah.
Before we get into Lufthansa, though, we're going to set up that heist a little bit, but a little bit earlier in Henry Hill's career and in the career of all of these guys, there was a really major heist for the time that is minuscule compared to Lufthansa. But there was the Air France robbery, and we really have to talk about that because it's parallels a lot of ways to Lufthansa. Maybe you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, the Air France robbery was basically, I would say, is Henry Hill's like pinnacle moment in his mob career, and I mean, it was a pretty easy heist. This is how easy things were back then, where like, Henry knew a guy that was part of the security working at the airport there, and he knew where all the money was being kept, and he gave Henry a tip. I think Jimmy had set up this type of system where if you couldn't pay off your debts or whatever, loan sharking or from his bookkeeping, you could pay it off by giving him tips about big money deposits that were happening at the airport. Because a lot of these guys that worked at the airport, like I said, like the mob was all over the place. So they were taking bets off these guys, and you find yourself in debt, and, somebody like Jimmy Burke, and, one thing leads to another. So they follow the security guard that was in charge at the time, and they're trying to find a weakness that this guy has. And apparently he has a weakness for women. So they hire like a prostitute to, butter him up for a couple of days. And then on the day that they're going to steal the money, take him out for a couple hours so they can get versions of steal his keys and, get copies made. And that was basically it. But it almost got screwed up because they almost didn't get to a locksmith in time. And then when they did get to the locksmith, they could only get so many of the keys made up because Henry failed to figure out which one of the actual keys opened the door to get to where the money was. So he just says, "Oh, just make them all." And I think they were 2 keys short. So I mean, they could have shown up there, and one of those 2 keys could have been the one that opened up the door. That would have been kind of funny. But yeah, that was it. And then they open up the door and stuff a suitcase full of cash and just walk out the door. It really that simple. That's how easy it was for them to just steal, $500,000.
So let's set up that's a setup that this crew, they knew how to steal from, and they especially knew how to steal from JFK Airport. Let's set up the heist a little bit of this one in Lufthansa. How did Hill and this crew find out and get us to right before the actual heist itself?
So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these bookkeepers and loan sharks had a system set up in place where if you couldn't pay your debt, you could pay it off by giving them insider information about what was going on in the airport. I'm assuming it wasn't just the airport too. They probably was for various other things. this guy, Lewis Warner, was in 20 grand in debt to a man named Marty Krugman, who's pretty famous in the movie Goodfellas for being this really annoying, just that doesn't stop bothering Jimmy about, where's my money? Where's my money? One thing I did learn, like in researching this episode, is like Marty Krugman in the movie, they make it seem like he wasn't really doing a lot. It turns out that he was doing actually a fair amount. He was a really big bookkeeper, and he was actually dealing drugs out of that wig shop. And I mean, he wasn't, he was Jewish, so he wasn't ever going to be like a made guy, but he probably would have been close to being a made guy in the mob if he was Italian. He was a pretty high associate in the Lucchese crime family. So Lewis Warner has all different types of problems. A divorce, and he owes Krugman $20,000, and I'm not exactly the equivalent to nowadays would be like $100K. So we're talking like a lot of money.
Yeah.
Oh, he's deep, right? And Krugman knows people like Jimmy Burke and has access to like other people in the mob if he doesn't pay up, right? So Lewis Warner gives him a tip about a heist about a shipment of money that's coming up. And Marty basically goes nuts. This is going to be, he says it's going to be about $2 million worth of stuff that's going to be there. And Marty goes nuts. Oh my God, this is going to be a heist of a lifetime. He immediately runs to Henry Hill because they were really good friends. Which in the movie Goodfellas, you get a sense that they're friends, but in researching this book, they were like really good friends. They were really close. I assume because his wife Karen was Jewish, and I'm assuming she was good friends with Krugman's wife, and that's kind of how that all started. And Henry goes and tells Jimmy, and Jimmy thinks about it for a little bit, and he says, "Yeah, let's do it." He starts putting together a crew.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Krugman, yeah, I think that was one of the things that really surprised me about Krugman is that he was instrumental, and he wasn't just a small time crook. He was full blown criminal.
Yeah,
just like all the rest of the guys, he had his facade and everything, and he was annoying to them.
Yeah.
But that was really how he operated. Now, once Warner has an inside view on how this whole thing works in Lufthansa. What do they actually do to steal the money?
Basically, Warner explained. Well, Jimmy sends once Jimmy accepts the job. Jimmy sends a guy, Joe Buddha, Joe Mantry.
That was it.
Yeah. So he sends him to go talk to Warner, but Warner doesn't actually know who Joe is. He uses a fake name. So Jimmy doesn't actually have any direct connection to Warner. And Warner doesn't know who Jimmy is. This is one of the brilliant things that Jimmy does is like, he does a really good job of making sure that he doesn't really have like a direct connection to the heist. There's like layers you got to peel back to get to where Jimmy is. And he basically explains to him, like, this is when the guys take lunch. This is what you're going to have to do to not trip off the alarms, because he works there, right? And he had already done it himself, but he almost had, oh yeah, I forgot to say, like he robbed the Lufthansa himself earlier for a small amount of money, but he almost got caught. So the next time, if we're going to do it, it's got to be at least $1 million. Otherwise it's not worth it. And so yeah, he shows them like, this is where explains to them where you have to put the key. This is where you want to keep all the guys. This is when they take their lunch break. This is who's going to be walking around the warehouse at the time. And so Joe takes this information back to Jimmy, and Jimmy, based off this information, starts putting together the crew that's going to get the job done.
One other thing that's probably worth mentioning is just how awash all of these guys were in drugs and alcohol. They were into heroin. Henry Hill, Jimmy, and the rest of them, they were into cocaine, into just every single alcohol. They were complete addicts in every single way going into this largest heist that any of them could ever imagine.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing to me because I knew from the movie that they were really big into the coke, but in the movie, it makes it seem like Jimmy wasn't doing any of the drugs, but Jimmy was doing as much drugs as Henry in a lot of ways. He was doing coke, he was doing heroin, and from what I read, Jimmy was basically a functioning alcoholic since the age of 14 or something crazy like that.
Now, what happened in the actual heist? It goes off not as smoothly as they expected it to go.
No, and it's just to me is like one of the more fascinating parts about the whole story is he puts this crew together, but like I mean the crew itself, there's nobody really remarkable in this crew. There's nobody in this crew that you would go, oh yeah, that's a really high Q individual that's going to be able to pull off one of the biggest heists in American history. Um, yeah, I mean, almost immediately they put together the crew, but like Tommy DeSimone screws up because he takes off his masks, takes off his mask or whatever, and one of the security guards sees him, and they're able to corral the guys into the lunchroom where they can, and then eventually they'll steal the money or what have you. But they've had to beat up a couple of guys, and I mean Tommy taking off his mask is the craziest thing to me. I just don't understand. Like, what were you thinking?
No, and that was really, I mean, that could have just collapsed the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just why I sat there and I thought, why would he take off his mask? And I just mean, the only thing I can think of is Tommy's just used to just doing crimes with not a mask on, that he just didn't think much of it and didn't think it was a big deal. But I mean, even the rest of the guys, like, they're a bunch of bumbling idiots. Like, it's amazing that they were able to pull this off.
I mean, they really, if you think back to last episode of The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, that's what they almost remind you of. It's almost not even satire with them taking your mask off.
Well, I was thinking about this in researching the project, and we had just done that movie. And I'm like, you could do the Lufthansa Heist, the comedy, and do it like as like kind of a spoofy, dark comedy. But you really could, because like all these guys, and we'll get into even just how dumb, like they get even dumber as even after they pull off the heist. Like they're in the truck and they're taking their gloves off, and I don't know, they're just not thinking like. So they pull off the heist. This is another funny story. So they pull off the heist, they get the money, and they have no idea how much they have. They have a feeling it's a lot more than initially what they thought. So they're driving down the road and they're driving the speed limit. They're trying not to draw attention to themselves, and they see like lights flashing in the back. And I believe it's Tommy screaming at the driver, speed up, the cops are coming, Those guys called the cops before we told them to, or what have you. And I think it was somebody else, one of the other guys in the van points out to, well, those are tow truck lights. So they were like, you know what I mean? Like they were going to speed down the road and draw all this heat to themselves. Potentially a cop sees them, pulls them over, and then then what do you do in that situation? I guess you'd have to kill the cop, because if you got caught, they're all looking at, 30 plus years in prison, right? And then you have to add that on top of it, all because you couldn't tell the difference between a police officer light and tow truck light.
And you just think of the volume of money, 6 million. It was about 5 million-ish in cash, and then $875,000 in jewelry. That's a massive amount of stuff. I mean, I can't even imagine. They don't really get into, because eventually we're not going to know any of what any of them had to say. But what did they say when they saw this mountain of gold and diamonds and jewels and cash? I mean, it must have been obvious that it wasn't $2 million.
I assume they probably thought, that's it. I'm done. I don't have to do any of this stuff anymore, or maybe they were freaking out a little bit, thinking, "Oh man, this is a lot more than like this. This is going to draw some serious heat. This is a lot more than the 2 million that they said it was going to be." I know maybe they were freaking out about that.
Well, that's
I mean,
an interesting point, because before all of this, all sorts of different arrangements were made up of people's cut from the heist, and it was all based on percentages, and they had based it off of $2 million. So Krugman's percentage got him about 20. Was it of 200,000? But they owed a percentage to Paul Vario, and then they had to make a percentage to the Gambino family because of the Gambino's turf in this. And all of that was based off of the 2 million, but now you're talking about percentages on a lot more.
6 million, right? And
Yeah.
then this will lead to other problems later because of Jimmy's greed and what have you. But so they pull off the heist pretty successful, I would say, successfully, minus Tommy taking off his mask and beating up a couple of security guards. I would say, given the collective IQ of the group involved, they did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
I would say, it's crazy. Like, we're talking just blue collar criminals, and they pulled off one of the biggest heists ever. So they go to the warehouse where they're supposed to meet up with Jimmy, and they're going to switch cars, right? Because they're going to get rid of this car, and they're going to so they're going to unload the car, and then they're going to take the car to the crusher, and that who's associated with the Gambino family. This is where the Gambinos kind of tie into the whole thing. Stax, who was was a good friend of Tommy's, actually, and was a good friend of a lot of these guys. He played like music at one of the bars that the local mob guys used to frequent, and everyone seemed to kind of like Stax. He was a funny guy, and he was easy to get along with. His job was he had to switch the license plates on the car so they were clean license plates, and then take the truck to the auto wreckers, where the auto wreckers would crush the car, and then there would be no getaway vehicle. Well, Stax decides, when he's driving to the auto wreckers, I feel like doing some drugs and meeting up with his girlfriend, and decides that he's going to do that. So he goes and does that. 2 days later, though, he parks in front of a fire hydrant, and he's there for 2 days and God has not crushed the car yet. And the cops find it, and they find the ski masks that they left in the truck and start dusting fingerprints, and they start finding fingerprints. Now, it's so crazy to me. Stax sees all the money coming off the truck. You realize there's no way that he doesn't realize this is a big deal, and he decides, I'm just going to do some drugs and have relations with my I don't know, my friend with benefit, or whatever you want to call her, and just not take the car to the auto wreckers for 2 days. How crazy is that?
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. That was the thing that could have absolutely destroyed them. I think there's two things that absolutely could have just eviscerated this whole thing, and the cops could have figured it out in maybe as little as hours afterwards, is that Stax not destroying the truck, and that Louis Werner himself was a big liability, that he knew the plan. I think with Louis Werner, there was enough insulation between him and Jimmy and Vario that it might have taken prosecutors a long time to unravel that. But this Stax thing, I mean, that's just so bananas that he would not do that. I mean, he wrote his own death warrant with that.
It's like, well, apparently like even after he does this screw up, apparently he was like going to the bars and like talking to people about like, I haven't got my cut yet, I haven't got my pay. It's like, buddy, you had the easiest job out of anybody and you screwed it up. Like all you had to do was just drive. I'm sure there was a car waiting for you so you can get back to your house as soon as you got this car crushed. It's not like you had to take a bus or something. I don't know. I wrap my mind around it. I'm like, and I Sadna, me and you were discussing this. Like, if he just gets the car to the auto records, does a lot of what comes after happen? I don't know if it happens or not, but this is what really triggers the sequence of events that happens in the next couple of months.
It really, if he had gotten the car to the Crushers, there'd be nothing. All they could have ever done is paint Lewis Werner that he was the mastermind. And Lewis Werner, even if he opened his mouth, there was no connection he could have ever had. I mean, it was brilliant in a way, but to have this guy Stax, and I don't know, I think maybe just because they thought Stax was cool, he was their pal for, I think with Tommy DeSimone, they had been friends. They went to high school together. They just figured he was good on his word to do this one very simple task. And they just underestimated his ability to do that one simple task.
I guess, but I mean, it's as simple of a task as it gets. Just drive it to the auto records. I'm sure he probably had been to that auto records before. Like, it's not, and if he had it, you just, give him a map. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. And this is where, like I was talking earlier, like how you could do a comedy film about this entire situation, because I mean, really, we're laughing about it, but this is directly leads to his death and a bunch of other people's death, because he was just so, not to be mean, but he was just so stupid. Like, how do you not get it to the auto records? There's no explanation for it.
So Stax, they whack him pretty early on, and it's devastating for Tommy. For somebody, I thought that was really interesting, is that Tommy, for an absolutely psychotic, cold-blooded killer, he was devastated that he was going to be the one who had to pull the trigger on Stax, but he did it.
He did it, and Paulie promised him that he was going to get his button if he was the one to kill Stax, because they just basically came to the conclusion that Stax was maybe going to be a little apprehensive about talking to anybody else, but he trusted Tommy because him and Tommy were such good friends. And I mean, it obviously worked. Tommy did it, and I think he shot him like 5 times or something like that. But yeah, and Tommy didn't want to do it. And it's interesting because in the movie, they don't really show in the movie Goodfellas. I had no idea that Tommy and Stax were good friends, but I found out in researching this for this episode.
Jimmy's got problems now, and it's almost inevitable that he would have these problems, because there's so much cash at hand and there's so many loose mouths around. What does Jimmy have to start doing to clean this up?
Basically has to start murdering everybody that has any connection, or at least can have a direct connection back to him in this heist. He starts asking Henry, do you think Marty Krugman's bugging him about his money? I mean, in Krugman's defense, this heist never would have went down if he didn't have the inside information that he had. But Jimmy doesn't want to pay him the money because Jimmy, as is depicted in the movie Goodfellas, does not like Marty at all. They're not friends at all. So, but Jimmy starts wondering, did he tell his wife about what happened? And then, it turns out that he actually did tell his wife about the heist. And Jimmy's like, well, he's got to go. So he kills Marty and starts whacking pretty much everybody else that was somewhat related to the crime, or he was at the very least was afraid was going to talk. And I mean, it works both ways. Jimmy gets to keep more of the money himself, because even Jimmy said it himself that greed's the thing that really took him down. And Jimmy was a greedy guy, but at the same time, he's protecting himself. He's basically came to this calculation, ruthless that it is, that if there's nobody to talk, then they can't pin this crime on me. I mean, and honest, it worked. They never charged Jimmy for this heist.
I really do. I believe that it was probably the best thing for Jimmy to do is to get rid of all the low level guys, pay off Paul Livario, pay off the Gambinos, pay off the people he had to pay off that there was no control over, and then be done with it. Because I think that was one thing that they, in the movie, that they got across well, is that all these people, once they got that money, they were going to blow it. And you can't have a guy with a couple of, a high couple of G's in his pocket. They are going to buy Cadillacs. They're going to buy things, and everybody and their brother in law enforcement eyes are going to be on these guys of why they're driving brand new Cadillacs, wearing fancy new clothes, buying apartments. Like, it was just going to be obvious. So I think in a lot of ways, Jimmy did what he had to do. There's the question of Henry, though, at this point. Henry makes the connection between Werner to Krugman to Jimmy, but Henry has nothing to do with the actual crime.
No, not really. Other than that, he gets a payout because he was the guy that brought the information to Jimmy via Krugman. Other than that, he didn't really have anything else to do with this heist. I assume because he was just so busy with his Boston point shaving scam and his own drug dealing. He was making, I guess he just figured I don't know, it just wasn't worth it, or he had too much at his plate at the time. I don't know. That's my guess.
In one of the books, he said that he didn't like the violence end of it, which seemed kind of like a cop out to me. I think maybe he did think that his point shaving scam was going to be a big deal, and we'll get into the point shaving scam. It was basically Henry had a deal set up with the Boston College basketball team to not throw games, but just kind of like we talked way back in our episode on 8 Men Out, that they point shaving in that it was just to play with the odds and play with the gambling. That will get Henry into a little bit of trouble, and it'll get some other people into trouble. I don't know. I think maybe in a way, maybe they didn't really trust Henry, or Henry had separated himself, that maybe he didn't want to be a shooter.
The violence thing, though, it seems a little bit believable, because everything that I've read about people talking about Henry, and then even Henry talking about himself, is Henry wasn't like Jimmy. He wasn't like Tommy. He liked doing scams. He liked making, he liked doing crime. He liked making money, but he wasn't a violent individual. Like, he would take care of business if he had to, right? Or somebody like Jimmy and Tommy legitimately seemed to enjoy inflicting violence on people, where Henry didn't really care all that much for it. I honestly think he was just making enough money that he just didn't feel like he needed to really be all that involved in it. And he was already going to get a payout anyways, right? Not a huge one, but he was going to get a fair amount of cash.
So in the end, really, initially, the only person who ever gets convicted of anything in related to this is Louis Werner. Henry Hill gets busted by the local cops, Nassau County cops, which is the county just east of New York City in the suburbs where he was living. And that's the thing that sort of breaks everything down, that Henry decides to completely flip and go state's evidence. And where does that go? And there's a story behind that, but I think it's not terribly interesting, really. I think the ultimate story is that he got busted and decided to rat.
Yeah, he gets busted for drug trafficking, and basically, because he was trafficking drugs or what have you. Paul Vario was pretty old school when it came to trafficking drugs. He had to warn Henry, he had warned everybody in his crew and people in the Lucchese crime family, like, if you deal drugs, that's it, you're done. I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to pull any strings with any of the judges I know. I'm not going to give you any money. I mean, it was, and, Paul had a very good rational explanation for it. He's like, if somebody's looking at a 30-year sentence and say they do get convicted for that 30-year sentence, I'm basically having to rely on them not getting depressed for the next 30 years while they're sitting in a cell and they're not getting to see their wife or their kids, or, just not wanting to be in prison anymore. It's just, as most people, he basically said like 99% of people are going to talk. So just don't do it because it's not worth it. Henry obviously doesn't listen. I mean, he says in his, well, and not his defense, he says the amount, like, I could sell a little brick, like a brick of cocaine. I would make the same amount of money that I did, jacking an entire transport truck, which required me stealing the transport truck, getting the goods off the transport truck, and then being able to sell the goods. So it's a lot more work, right? Drugs, it's quick, it's easy money, and you can make a tons of money. He gets caught, and Jimmy's afraid that he's going to rat about the Lufthansa heist too. So Paulie wants him dead. Jimmy wants him dead. Henry just comes to the conclusion, I'm a dead man. I might as well talk, right? So, he enters the witness protection program. But they initially wanted him to enter because they thought he was going to give them information on the Lufthansa heist, and he doesn't give them anything. And I mean, the history speaks for itself. They never found the money, and Jimmy never actually got convicted of it. He does give them the Boston point shaving scam, though. But he does that like by accident. He's just like talking to the FBI agents, and he's like, oh yeah, and we were doing this with college basketball or something, not even thinking it's a big deal. And one of the agents happened to play for I believe it was one of the teams that was involved in this scam, and he freaks out. And this is basically how they get Polio. This is how they get Paulie and Jimmy is on this Boston point shaving scam, because they're like, well, we can't get him on the numerous murders that we know Jimmy Burke has committed, because we can't connect him to any of them. We can't get him on the heist, but we're going to get him on the point shaving scam, and then we're just going to charge him up the wazoo for it.
That's how they really get Jimmy Burke. They get Paulie was in and out of jail constantly for different things. Paulie does some time for that. He may have died in prison, but I don't know if he died in prison for that. Because he was in prison so often. They got a murder charge to stick to him, but that was not a federal murder charge. It was a state murder charge. And that's really, the feds got nothing out of Henry. And we got Jimmy Burke in jail. He died in 1996, I want to say, of cancer. But if he hadn't gotten cancer and died, he was due for parole in just a few years after that.
I know, that's crazy to think about today. And then, because there's good evidence that Jimmy probably killed like 40, 50 people.
Yeah.
But they can't, there's no bodies, right? But they know, the cops, the authorities, and the people, have the more of the information, say like, yeah, he probably killed 40 people. And you were mentioning Paulie, like, in and out of jail. I think he was actually in jail 40 times. I read somewhere 40 times he went to jail, which is it's just so crazy. I mean, but they could never get anything to stick for longer sentences up until, Henry decides to talk.
And honestly, for getting pinched and going to the can for Paulie was nothing new. So you put him away for kind of a minor league point shaving thing. And then Jimmy goes to jail for one murder out of the 50, at least, that he probably did. It's pretty useless, I would say, in a way, because they gave the farm away to Henry Hill, the feds, to put him into witness security. They dropped every state charge against him. They dropped, I believe, charges, anything. He wasn't going to get charged for anything he had done in the past. And Henry Hill was a hardcore criminal.
And that's what blows my mind, is the fact that they didn't charge him for anything. Like, they knew that he was like jacking stuff at the airport. They knew about the drug dealing. I mean, he admitted to like being an accomplice in murder that they couldn't really prove, because he talked about Tommy and Jimmy killing Billy at the mate guy that we had talked about earlier. They knew that he had something to do with the Lufthansa heist, even if it was very distant. He was one of the guys transporting information, and they knew, basically Henry knew that if he wasn't in witness protection, it wasn't in the witness protection program, he was a dead man. So I don't understand why they gave him such a sweetheart deal. I can understand maybe reducing the sentence because you gave information that did directly lead to Jimmy getting arrested and Polly. But to do no time at all, that blows my mind. Like, to me, it's unacceptable.
I mean, he really, in a way, pulled a scam on the feds too, when you get down to brass tacks. And I think the thing that really bothers me is that this guy Henry Hill gets a complete free ride. He's in witness security, so he's getting new identities. And another really famous one that we'll get to at some point is Sammy the Bull Gravano. Henry Hill pretty much led a life of crime for the rest of his life, except for participating in these couple of books that he was involved in. And he had a couple of businesses, but he was still into drugs. He was still into stealing. He was even married to 2 women at one time, which bigamy is a crime in most states.
Yeah. That's basically, that's something. I mean, he got paid, I think it was $500,000 for helping on the movie Goodfellas. Basically, one of his cases went to the Supreme Court, I believe, when Wise Guys was written or whatever. And New York had I believe it was the Son of Sam laws. Like, you're not allowed to directly get profit off crimes that you committed. And I'm not sure of all the legality in it, but the Supreme Court says, no, it's fine in this case, or what have you.
Probably because he was never convicted for anything. I think that was what the Son of Sam law. You can't say that somebody can't profit off of their crimes when they haven't been convicted of a crime. But it's just it's insane that he's just making money. Gave the people, that's what we're talking about, the government. He never gave us anything for it. None of these criminals went to jail. We never saw a dime of the money of Lufthansa back, and he gets to live scot-free.
And I mean, the way, even afterward, the way he talks about it, like, he would joke about, so, well, I'm the only one left alive out of any of those guys, like, I'm the winner in the end. Like, like, Henry's the smartest guy in the world. And the more I read about Henry, the less I liked him, because he wasn't really particularly, I don't know, he doesn't come across to me as particularly super intelligent. He just seems like he was a scummier guy out of all the scumbags, I guess, where Henry enjoyed the mob lifestyle until it became, until the negative aspects of it came out. And he's just like, oh, no, don't want to do with that. He enjoyed the witness protection program until he realized he couldn't be a criminal anymore. And he's just like, oh, no, I want out of the witness protection program. It's just, you know what I mean? He just comes across as that type of guy where I don't know, was Henry ever honest with anybody in his entire life? And there's really no excuse for it. Like, we talked about his early familyhood. It's not like it wasn't terrible. It wasn't the greatest, but it wasn't horrendous in comparison to what other people were living through at the time.
Maybe we'll end with our final words on this really big story. I mean, for me, my final thought is that it's amazing to me that nobody got really ever really punished except for one person, the Louis Werner. And The money's gone. I can't believe there's not more talk of trying to find where this money went to. I mean, I would just love to know where the money went.
Yeah, so would I. I mean, he covered his tracks so well, but he must have told somebody where the money was, or at least some of it was, right? I've heard theories that maybe one of his daughters has it, or had it, or has it somewhere, and maybe she's just very smart. And because from my understanding, they don't really live like flashy lifestyles, so maybe I don't know. She has it in a shoebox in the attic and only pulls it out and like every once in a while when she needs it, or I don't know, maybe it's buried in a hole somewhere. I mean, that's what I would do with a big chunk of it. I would just bury it in a hole in the field and leave some kind of marker that only I would really know. I mean, there's risk involved in that. Maybe a dog digs it up or something like that, or that is a risk, right? But I mean, if it's buried in a hole, no one's going to find it. But it is fascinating that they never found any of the money, none of the jewelry, nothing.
So what's your final word on this? What's maybe one thing that really sticks in your craw? I think I have a feeling what it is.
Henry is a complete scumbag. I mean, that's the thing that drives me nuts. What did you think it was?
I thought it was going to be with Stax not getting rid of the truck.
Oh yeah, that's that.
That just is
if I woke up in the morning, if I woke up in the morning and I'm Jimmy, and I'm like, find out that they found the truck, and I'm seeing this on the news, and I'd be like, you're making it really hard for me to not kill people. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what I'd probably be thinking to myself, because you basically left them no choice. Like, that's the event that led to everything else. If that truck just goes away, maybe it's a happy ending for everybody involved. I mean, Tommy was going to get it one way or another because of what he did, but I don't know, maybe Henry doesn't end up going in the witness protection program, or maybe he gets busted but doesn't feel like he needs to go in the witness protection program because, I mean, maybe, Paulie would have been done with them, but there would have been really no reason for Jimmy to do. But I don't know, maybe, I don't know. I guess he still would have entered it because Jimmy would probably still be afraid that he would talk, but he'd probably be a lot less afraid that the truck had just gone to the auto records.
So we're going to leave it with that image in your mind. Next week, we're going to talk about the movie Goodfellas and some of the scenes we really liked, some of the aspects we didn't like. There's a lot to really like about this movie. But if there's mafia movies or really movies of any sort that you really want to hear and to talk with us because you're a part of this, come and join us and reach out by email, Facebook. It's Facebook at the moment. Comment on the YouTubes and the live stream and come join the live streams. They're going to be on Thursdays now. So come, you're a part of this. So join us. And I'm Steve signing off. I'll talk to you next time. Chris, Mustache Chris, as always, a blast.